for 10 years I had bad dreams. And when I had small children myself, I remember having a dream that we were going to go to camp. And we must take with us everything that we're going to need for the next 3 years. And I must think, what do I need? I need this and that for the children. I must have this, I must have this, I must have this. And I was busy making sure we had everything because we were going to camp.
On December 7, 1941, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor marked the outbreak of the Pacific War. Citizens of Allied nations living in China awoke to find that their countries were at war with Japan. Cut off from their homelands and faced with an uncertain future, for these people, it was like a nightmare come true. After the Opium War, China opened its doors to the outside world and large numbers of Westerners came in. It was a time of huge social changes. In the first half of the 20th century, large numbers of Westerners already lived in China, working as missionaries, doctors, teachers, or businessmen. Despite their different nationalities and professions, they were all considered foreigners. Even though many spoke Chinese and ate Chinese food, and some Western families had lived in China for generations. On July 7, 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge sparked Japan's full-fledged invasion of China. Many of China's foreign residents were citizens of neutral countries and for various reasons chose not to leave, preferring to stay and suffer the ravages of war in their adopted home. Innocent people were taken hostage by the war machine, and many happy childhoods came to a sudden halt. Only to be replaced by the shared memories of the Weixian internment camp.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House denounces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Stay tuned to WOR for further development.
After Pearl Harbor, Japan and the U.S. formally declared war, and World War II became a truly global war. In reprisal for the internment of Japanese Americans, Japan established an immigrant internment camp in the Shandong Province in Wei County, in the area today called Weifang. Known as the Weixian internment camp, it became a wartime home to as many as 2,250 citizens of Allied countries, including over 300 children.
The Japanese troops and officials occupied our houses and kept us in the houses for quite a few weeks. We were under house arrest. And then they allowed us to move out of our houses. They took account of all our possessions. They took some of our possessions. The money that we received from our home countries, Britain and America, was of course cut off when war began because the banks were not operating.
The worst thing that happened was just shortly after the war broke out, after the Japanese guards, the Navy officers, they came to our school. They said they wanted all the older girls to be comfort women for the Japanese Navy. The headmaster and others, they talked for 6 hours. And they said, this is a boarding school. We are responsible for these people. It's an international crime to do such a thing. So in the end, they went away and they said, we will make our decision. They never came back, but what they did was to take Korean girls.
Weixian is located in the central Shandong Province and is an important stop on the Qingdao-Jinan Railway, with convenient rail links to Beijing, Tianjin, Jinan, and other major cities in northeastern China. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese decided to create a camp in a U.S. Presbyterian church compound called Ledoyuan, or the Courtyard of Happy Way. Beginning in 1943, group after group of Westerners arrived in Weixian under military escort from Beijing, Tianjin, Qingdao, Taiyuan, Yantai, and other Japanese-occupied areas.
Frank Dorn. 他在集中营里面。
Australian-born Joyce has deep feelings for China. Her father was an officer in the Salvation Army and a talented musician who could play a number of instruments.
He got on his bicycle and he went to every mission station in Beijing. And he said, we don't know where we're going, and we don't know how long we'll be there, but we will need music wherever we are. If you have an instrument, please take it along.
Aside from a few necessities, people bound for Weixian were not allowed to bring anything with them. Still, some people found clever ways to sneak musical instruments past the Japanese guards. What the Weixian inmates did manage to bring with them was something that no invader could take away. Courage in the face of hardship, and an abiding belief in love and human dignity.
My father had a very ingenious plan, and he put all three between the two mattresses, and then he put the springs on the outside, and then he bound it up with this rope. And Japanese thought it was just the beds going in, but it was musical instruments going in.
The first day, that was after a long trip, that lasted maybe 2 or 3 days, and it was in the afternoon. And in March, I think around the 17th of March, something like that. So we were rather surprised because that was not exactly a prison. That was the houses in the building of a Presbyterian mission. But the Japanese had added towers to watch on 6 corners with machine guns.
Now the Japanese soldiers just ruined the compound. They took almost everything out of the hospital or broke it down. Most of the windows were broken. The toilet facilities were all broken up and were not working. And a lot of the buildings were broken. And so when we arrived, it was, as it were, hardly fit to live in.
Ledoyuan's 11 hectares were divided by walls into separate living areas for the Japanese and the foreign inmates. The better buildings were used by the Japanese, while the immigrants were left with dilapidated buildings and streets covered with weeds and garbage. Families lived together in small dormitory rooms, while single males and females lived communally in classrooms or meeting rooms. The inmates had no access to running water. They were forced to share primitive toilets, crude stoves, 2 shower rooms, 3 large communal kitchens, a dilapidated church, and an empty hospital.
And I think it was like any other village with 2,000 people inside, with the good, the bad, the nice people and those that weren't so nice.
The outlook at first was dire. The compound was in worse shape than they could have imagined. The inmates were given little food and forced to do physical labor to which they were not accustomed. Add to this the conflict that is bound to occur when so many people from different nationalities are squeezed in together. And it is easy to see why desperation set in. For the inmates of Weixian, life had taken an abrupt turn for the worse.
And finally, amongst us, we organized. Not taking care of the Japanese, we just, between ourselves, we organize and say, what can you do?
The Japanese agreed to allow the inmates to govern themselves. Amid the chaos, discussions were held and representatives elected, and the Self-Governance Committee was formed. The camp was divided into 4 divisions, with each division sending 9 representatives. These 36 people form 9 committees: education, management, engineering, barracks, healthcare, food supply, finance, labor, and discipline. It was these committees that were responsible for managing camp affairs and for accommodating, negotiating with, and struggling against their Japanese captors. According to Japanese regulations, all inmates, men and women, were required to work. Only infants, invalids, and those over 80 years old were exempt. The Self-Governance Committee found people to work as bakers, cobblers, maintenance men, boiler technicians, and doctors and nurses. They repaired the hospital, put in a drainage system, and fixed the toilets. People took turns cooking, washing clothes, tending fires, making charcoal, and emptying the garbage. Children went to school, then after school took their turns working.
We would assign the jobs to look after our little community. So I did the laundry, I did the washing. My brother, Norman, was stoking the fire, putting the coal on the fire and making the hot water, and I was at the tub scrubbing with many other people, scrubbing the sheets and the clothes. But we had no soap. We were bitten all night by the bed bugs, and there were spots of blood on the sheets, and I was trying to get it out, but I couldn't get them out, never. So we just did our best.
When I was first in the camp, one of my jobs was to take the rubbish out. We had to gather the rubbish and take it out in carts outside the camp, about 100 or 200 meters outside the camp. And it may sound a dirty job, but it's difficult to describe to you the thrill of being able to get outside the camp. 15 or 1600 of us in there. So to actually get outside the camp, oh, the relief, that was wonderful.
In the fertile soil of the camp, seeds took root. They were inmates in an internment camp, but it was their internment camp, their history, and their destiny. To prevent communication with the outside world, the Japanese erected high walls around the camp and covered them with electric wire. But this didn't diminish the generosity of the local Chinese residents, who provided the inmates with invaluable help over the course of their imprisonment, creating lasting bonds of friendship. A black market was organized by Australian priest Father Scanland, and with the help of Chinese locals, goods were traded late at night in a hidden corner in the camp's northeast sector.
那个交易是天天交易，所以他们物资也需要，只是那会儿糖小的最多，一麻袋大概是几百斤吧，那会儿那个麻袋都是10麻袋装那个糖，都是面糖、白面糖，一会儿得购买那么一麻袋的给它包装起来的。
The process of procuring supplies was a dangerous one for the inmates, who risked being discovered by the Japanese guards. But for the Chinese, who carried the goods over the electric fence in the middle of the night, these black market transactions were truly terrifying.
走电网的时候必须躺木板，这面躺木板， 下面再躺木板，因为它这个2层电网的形状，这么上去，里边还一层电网那么下去，说必须两个电，两边都躺木板才能过得去。
Danger was everywhere, but the will to live kept these nighttime activities going, even under the watchful eye of the Japanese searchlights. However, some Chinese locals paid a disastrous price.
结果西上运一个年轻小伙子叫韩翔，也上那去交易，掉到电网上了。结果收的时候成黑炭了。
The Japanese left his corpse on the wire as a frightening and ultimately effective warning to anyone who offered help to the foreign inmates.
And at that point, quite a number of the internees who had been working over the wall with the Chinese decided that we should not carry on because it wasn't a danger to us if we were caught, and we should just be put into solitary confinement. The Chinese who were seeking to help us, they were in risk of dying, as that one had died. And so at that time, the trade over the wall began to ease off, and after about 9 months, 12 months, very little food came in.
A report on Weixian released by the Shanghai Consulate General on March 9, 1944, indicates that the camp's Japanese personnel changed frequently, but generally consisted of a commanding officer, divisional officers, a police chief, and 30 to 40 police officers. The Japanese army had not made adequate preparations and lacked the management experience necessary to manage such a camp. They were trying to enforce harsh living conditions to humiliate the inmates and break their will. The physical labor took its toll, and arthritis, back pain, and nerve damage were common. Many inmates also suffered from diarrhea, gastric ulcers, diabetes, tuberculosis, and other acute or chronic illnesses requiring special treatment. Fortunately, there were no major outbreaks of contagious diseases. Both physically and psychologically, inmates were stretched to their limits. Without their black market food source, hunger set in. Taking control of their own destinies, the inmates sent messages into the outside world telling of their plight. It was at this time that the former Guangwen Middle School principal Huang Lede and others took action.
当时这个集中营里边那个戴维斯，他曾经是我爷爷的老师，他非常信得过，非常喜欢我爷爷这个学生，所以他就托这个送份人张兴泰出来捎信给我爷爷讲了集中营里边的困难情况，急需要帮助。
Entry to the camp was strictly controlled. The only Chinese people allowed in on a regular basis were workers who delivered food, cleaned the latrines, and did repair work. Zhang Xingtai, who emptied the camp's latrines, was one of the few Chinese people allowed in.
俺父亲屋里打扫茅房，屋的管呱呱。那个戴维斯呢，就是茅房，也要出装上茅房，在茅房里谈话。他说现在啊，这里边这个2000多人，这个吃用、医药 也没有，条件非常差。通过你吧写封信出去找黄老队，找黄老队吧，叫他求求帮助。他把那个信呢，就放入那个电木头桶的那个木头底下垫着。他这个老队那个没有这个下脚那个驴坐不住啊，一下的是咣当，反正拉一路。日本人一看就是50个飞机，快走，就带出来了。
When Huang Lede received a letter from the camp, he and his family began raising money for the inmates. The complex political situation hindered their efforts. But after overcoming numerous setbacks, he convinced senior Kuomintang leaders from Changle and Shouguang to contribute.
募到这些钱吧，和家里自己的钱加起来一共有30万。
Over 3 separate attempts, the Huangs were able to raise the equivalent of over $100,000 US. The money was given to a diplomat at the Swiss consulate in Qingdao, who used it to buy urgently needed supplies in the name of the International Red Cross, which were gradually transferred into the camp. The Weixian inmates took control of their own fates, and by forming the Self-Governance Committee, took control of their own affairs. They maintained their dignity in the face of adversity, and turned what could have been a nightmare into a source of inspiration. People were quickly organized according to their professions and talents. Among the inmates were accomplished artists and musicians who used their free time to record impressions of camp life in watercolors and charcoal sketches. A band was organized and named the Salvation Army Band. It played frequently at both the hospital and the church, and its music helped bring people together and comfort lonely hearts. These watercolors, though painted inside the camp, are full of lively colors. Steel wire and high walls may imprison the body, but they cannot imprison the yearning for liberty or dim a spirit born to shine. The inmates even cleared out 2 athletic grounds which were used for football, softball, basketball, hockey, and horseshoes. They made the most of their allotted activity periods to host a wide variety of athletic competitions. Dances, plays, and jazz band performances were also held, along with the celebrations at Christmas and Easter. For the camp's inmates, these activities were a spiritual release and an opportunity to give the children something normal among the chaos, to enrich them and brighten their outlook on life.
I should tell you that the teenagers, we had names for the guards. And one guard in particular we called Buxingdi, because everything you wanted to do, he would say, Buxing, Buxing, Buxing. That's all the Chinese he had. I remember Buxingdi came to the show that this dance band was putting on. They were putting on special music. Wxinpai was sitting in the front row because he had to, you know, make sure we weren't doing anything wrong. And very quickly, this singer said, "I want to dedicate this next song to Wxinpai." And he said it very quickly. So we heard it, but the guard didn't hear it. And he started in this song, which I've never heard since, but he said, "I wish you were dead, you rascal, you." And of course, we all laughed and laughed, and of course, Wxinpai didn't know what we were laughing about, and he kept looking around like this. But you know, we used to have fun in the camp.
During the routines of camp life, the inmates never gave up hope. They encouraged and cared for each other, and quietly filled the camp with a sense of optimism and a keep trying attitude. Among the many inmates, one special group was that of over 300 children. Some were from the Yantai Zhifu School, founded by Westerners before the war. The rest had been sent to the camp with their parents. Faced with these innocent eyes, the inmates had no choice but to care for and educate them, and see to it that they grew up healthy.
We were marched into this concentration camp, and our teachers said, "How do you keep the spirit alive in the midst of a bloody war?" She said, the teacher said, "We will try to make the world as normal as we could for these children. Try to make the world just like it was before if we can." The teacher said, "Listen to this. We will get out of this place. God will take us out of this place, and when we get out, you're going to have to compete with other boys and girls who've been going to school in America and England and Australia."
The camp's adults and teachers quickly began providing for the children's education as if by instinct. After repeated negotiations with the Japanese, former Qilu University Dean L.J. Davies won for the children the right to an education. The Self-Governance Committee established an education committee that was responsible for finding teachers and creating classes from kindergarten through high school. They set up a kindergarten and daycare center for children 6 and under, and 2 schools for children from 7 to 16, based on the US and UK educational systems, respectively. With no classrooms available, classes were held outdoors during the spring, summer, and fall. During the bone-chilling winters, classes were moved into the cramped dormitories, where children studied sitting on beds or suitcases. When they were sent to Weixian, the teachers insisted that the students carry their books with them. Once inside the camp, the books were circulated and passed down from one class to the next, allowing the camp schools to teach English, French, Latin, math, biology, history, and geography.
We sometimes wrote in pen, but quite often we wrote in pencil and rubbed it out and started again because there was no fresh paper. But I didn't want to show you one or two of my other books. They weren't so neat. This is a neater one. So this is my science book. There's a picture of a heart. And not to read in detail, but you see the sort of thing that we did then.
Teachers focused on continuing the education of their students so that they would not fall behind their peers on the outside. The teachers made their little world as pleasant and normal as possible, to the extent that many people who lived here as children remember it exclusively as a happy time. The only thing that reminded them that they were prisoners of the Japanese was the roll call every morning at 7:30.
This is my prisoner badge, which I had to wear every time to roll call, in the morning and in the afternoon. If it was snowing, we still had to go out. If the sun was beating down, we still had to go out. And we stood there for about an hour every morning and afternoon. Now these days you can't imagine it. We had to number in Japanese. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and we had to learn to count in Japanese.
From the September 18th incident in 1931 through the outbreak of war in the Pacific, Japan had continually encroached on China. And as the battle lines lengthened, Japan's limitations as a small island nation were exposed. Supplies were running low, troop morale was low, and civilians, including children, were being forced onto the front lines. Japan was running out of options. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, Japan lost large amounts of equipment and suffered heavy casualties, and its military power began to wane. To keep the war machine running, the country would have to pay a heavy price. As Japan's military power waned, life at Weixian became more and more difficult.
Our food deteriorated as time went on in Weixian. But you see, the Chinese around were suffering, weren't they? And the Japanese had very little food. So if they weren't going to give us extra. We were prisoners.
The teachers were used to the challenges of educating young minds, but they were unprepared for the toll that the camp was taking on their students' health. Long-term malnourishment had left the children emaciated and their teeth dull. Some even stopped growing altogether. As time went on, the camp's doctors became very concerned about the poor quality of the food and its impact on the children's health, particularly the lack of calcium.
And after all, we were just the right age to be interned, because being 16, my bones had grown. It was quite interesting. My first wisdom tooth was half out, and none of my wisdom teeth moved all through camp. And I hadn't been in England 3 months before I had all 4 of them.
Our teachers were afraid that we would be lacking in calcium. So they took eggshells and ground them. And then they said, come along, a spoonful a day. And so we had to try and swallow the stuff. It was very fluffy, very powdery, and very dry.
In addition to a shortage of food and an even more severe shortage of medicine, clothing for the children was in short supply, particularly shoes. Many children went barefoot in the spring, summer, and fall, just so that they would have shoes to wear in the winter. Even in these trying conditions, teachers did not relax their demands on students or let them feel sorry for themselves. On the contrary, they made all the children feel loved and insisted that they remain courteous and respectful, even to the Japanese guards.
Well, our teacher said, you have to march in a straight line, and you have to have your back up straight, be proud. They said, you might be a prisoner on the outside, but you're not a prisoner on the inside. One set of manners in the Weixian concentration camp, and another set of manners for the princesses in Buckingham Palace in England.
And they had the forethought of bringing in previous year's Oxford Local School Certificate examination papers. And so they said, look, you're here, we don't know how long this will last, you have an opportunity to study, we will have school as far as we can, and we will try and set exams. And hopefully, when the day comes for victory, then we will be able to bring your papers home to England and the Oxford authorities will accept them. So work towards that end.
In the camp, every detail mattered. Courtesy and personal hygiene were strictly enforced. Socks and shoes were kept clean and neat even as they fell apart at the seams. Even under these extreme conditions, idle time was strictly limited. Classes were held at regular hours, and students were still tested according to Oxford University standards.
I sat in a kitchen, and my feet were where the ashes come out from the cooker, and we had boards across, and I was given the allotted time, and it was invigilated very carefully, so they could tell the authorities that it was all done very properly, as usual, and I sat the exam. Then they kept the papers. Our teachers read them, and they said, we're not quite sure if you've passed or not, because they were cautious. But they kept them to the end of the war.
And after the war, the headmaster took these two exams that the children had written. He took them personally to Oxford University, and he said, these are the exams they did in the concentration camp. Please, will you accept them? And they looked at them, and they marked them, and most of us passed.
It is worth noting that 3 classes from Estelle and Margaret's Yantai Zhifu school graduated while at the camp. The first 2 classes graduated with 100% success. And even the 3rd class, despite the deteriorating political situation, still graduated 9 of its 11 students. Most of the students went directly to Oxford after the war. The 1981 movie Chariots of Fire, which won 4 Academy Awards, is based on the true story of Eric Liddil, one of the most illustrious of the camp's inmates. A pious Christian, Liddil refused to run the finals of the 100-meter dash at the 1924 Paris Olympics because it was held on a Sunday. A teammate gave him the chance to run the 400 meters instead. And he not only won the race, but did it in world record time.
当我们到了这个集中营的时候，一听说1924年奥运的这个英雄在我们的集中营，哇，那就带给我们很大的兴趣。
Just 1 year after the Olympics, Liddil left behind the fame he had won for himself and came back to China, his birthplace, as a missionary and teacher at Tianjin New Learning Middle School.
他这个人很结实，个子并不很高。他穿衣服也是穿得很朴素了，很精神。他的这个无论是在体育场里面呢，在校园里面呢，他是一个很活泼、很高兴的，是吧？永远带着笑容所以很喜爱中国学生在一起的这么一位老师。
When Japan openly invaded China in 1937, Liddil remained in the country he loved. In May 1941, he sent his pregnant wife and 2 daughters to safety in Canada. He was later arrested by the Japanese, and in March 1942, he was sent to Weixian. In the camp, Liddil was assigned to the task of teaching science at the school and organizing athletic activities. He also acted as an overseer of the communal dorm where the single men and children lived. He took jobs that no one else would do, like clean the toilets and make cold briquettes out of coal dust and clay. He also helped care for the camp's elderly, sick, and weak, chopping wood for them and standing in line to buy their coal and other ration goods.
He made a book for me of the we didn't have any books to study, but he wrote out all the rules of chemistry, and I studied with him there.
This is the chemistry textbook that Liddil wrote at the camp, relying only on his remarkable memory. It is a piece of the camp's history and one of Joyce's most prized possessions. Stephen was one of Liddil's students and also worked with him on the camp's self-governance committee, planning sports and musical activities. At the time, Stephen was 17 and Liddil was 43, but they spent a lot of time together and became close friends despite their age difference.
We would talk about many different things, but he would never talk about his Olympic fame. He wouldn't talk about that. He was a very modest person. And we all liked him very much.
The endless stream of children who came looking for Eric was a constant irritation to his roommate, who eventually made a card for the door with "Eric is in" and "Eric is not in" written on the both sides to give the children an idea of his whereabouts.
他在奥运的时候，因为他是一个虔诚的基督徒，要做礼拜，他就不赛跑，100米他就不跑了。可是，在集中营的时候，他发现这些孩子礼拜天没有事情干，就做一些不该做的事情，他马上出来。
During the Olympics, Liddil refused to run on Sunday, but in the camp, he changed this long-held habit. And for the sake of the children and their health, He organized Sunday activities.
所以你在这一方面就看见他的信仰，不是四四方方的，真是一个很活的。他可以在他信仰方面就站稳，但是他看见这些孩子走错路的时候，他一定要伸出手来帮助他们。